everyone, Cassius here, welcoming you back to the Shakespeare Minute. Today we have the top 5 villains. This episode is villain number 2, Richard III from the Henry VI plays and Richard III. This guy is quite something, and I'm not sure that any other Shakespeare character racks up the body count that he does. Between the several plays that he's in, he manages to get his sword, whether his own personal sword or a hired hand sword, on so many people's lives that it's hard to keep track after a while. In the Wars of the Roses, his father, the Duke of York, is the head of one side, the Yorks, and fighting for his father, he kills a fair number of people, including Edward, the Prince of Wales, and his father, Henry VI. Now, that later murder is actually seen as a murder. It's not during a battle. It's simply Richard coming up to Henry VI and saying, well, you die now, even though he's been imprisoned and it's after the battle and everything's been resolved in favor of the Yorks. Richard goes in and says, I'm going to kill you now. Once the play Richard III begins, after Henry VI's death, and Edward IV, Richard's older brother, has been planted on the throne, his murderous tendencies come to the fore a little bit more in this speech you may have heard of.
And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover, I'm determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days.
Well, he's determined to prove a villain, so he becomes one in a pretty big way. He plays his brother, Edward IV, off of his brother, the Duke of Clarence, having his brother, the King, believe that his brother, the Duke of Clarence, is a threat to him and his children. In believing this, he sentences Clarence to the Tower and eventually to death. Richard makes sure that the death sentence is not overruled, knowing that Edward might deliver a counter-order to the death sentence. He sends murderers to this jail cell to make sure that any counter-order is not fulfilled. With his brother, the Duke of Clarence, out of the way, all Richard has to do is wait for the old, sick Edward IV to die, thus putting the kingdom into the hands of his children, 2 very young sons. Now, what exactly do you do with that? I mean, you've got these kids there, and, goodness knows there are people there watching them, so what do you do? Richard consolidates his power, making sure that anyone with access to the children has their access limited. Their mother, he forces away from them. He kills everyone related to the Queen because, well, after all, they used to be commoners. She's only elevated because she married the king, and God knows he shouldn't have done that. So anyone related to her, her children by her first marriage, her brothers, anyone who's a political threat, Richard and his ally, the Duke of Buckingham, have, well, horribly killed. The minute anyone says that they're against Richard being the king or gaining power, he simply has them killed, and then connives his way through the court of popular opinion to become the favored choice over his brother's children, who he claims are illegitimate, and, well, he has a whole host of other reasons. He knows that none of them are true, however, and that baby Edward V is actually a threat in his own right. He's a political powerhouse, even though he's as young as he is. Now, at the beginning of this play, Richard claims that he wants to give up any personal life and any romantic life because, well, I'm not attractive, so I may as well give that up to be my villainous political self that I've talked a bit about already. But in the beginning, you've got Lady Anne mourning the death of her father-in-law, the King, Henry VI. She used to be married to the Prince of Wales, who, if you'll remember, Richard had killed in the Henry VI plays. So clearly she's very upset, and she knows that the man who killed her husband and her husband's father is Richard, Duke of Gloucester, at this point. Richard, however, manages to win her over by saying he did this all for her, and using an incredible amount of psychological torture, manages to win her over in a very bizarre way. Even he can't really believe it.
Was ever woman in this humour wooed? Was ever woman in this humour won? I'll have her, but I'll not keep her long. What? I, who killed her husband and his father, to take her in her heart's extremist hate with curses in her mouth, tears in her eyes, and then to win her. All the world to nothing.
He marries her, and by the time he's king and ready to take on his brother's still living children, he has made Lady Anne, the woman who was ready to curse him to hell in the beginning of the play, his queen. He then says to his allies, well, my brother's children are still alive. That's a problem, because if he has sons, they could take over. Make sure they're not alive. And thus, the pièce de résistance, the murder of his nephews, which cements his rule and cements his place as a bloody tyrant. He killed his way to the throne, and, well, he keeps killing once he's there to make sure that his reign is solid. It's exactly the same kind of thinking that got him to the throne. It's not so much a defensive mechanism, the way that it is for many of the villains we've seen so far. It's simply him killing his way to the throne. There were actually heirs to the line of York, and even though he had the crown on his head, he didn't feel like he was king yet, so he's going to have them killed as well. He then probably has his wife Anne killed. She might commit suicide, but since he's the one who, before she's remotely dead, claims that she's going to be, we can safely say that he plans her death as well. And then he commits his final cruel acts, telling Lord Stanley that if he doesn't fight eagerly for Richard, that, well, he'll have George Stanley, his son, killed. He goes to Queen Elizabeth, who was his brother's wife, and says, I know I killed your children and your brothers, and, your husband is dead, and I've been taking advantage of that, and I blamed you for everything that I did and for all the turmoil at court, but I want to marry your daughter. He does this because he wants to cement his place as king, but the way that he browbeats her into it is so horrifying, and he tries to get her to agree to this. Well, at this point, he has overstepped his bounds. Elizabeth is not convinced the way Lady Anne was. She is horrified, and she runs off to have her daughter marry Richard's opponent in the final wars. Richard is so terrifying that by the end, even he's not sure how to deal with himself and his crimes anymore.
Is there a murderer here? No. Yes, I am. I love myself, but why? For any good that I myself have done unto myself. Oh no, alack, I rather hate myself.
For being so evil that even he has to cower at his own presence. Richard jumps up to spot number 2, and quite possibly number 1 if we're just going by body count. His crimes are murders, almost too many to count, and browbeating the various women in his life, mostly because his mother didn't love him. That's right, his motivation, his ugliness. But it's not just that he's unsettled during peacetime because he's too ugly to dance with women, but rather the fact that he was born this way, and as soon as he came into this world, his mother had no use for a baby as scary as he was. So with that, we round out villain number 2. Tune in shortly for villain number 1. Think of the world.
I can smile and murder while I smile, and wet my cheeks with artificial tears, and frame my face to all occasions.